All right. We are live, and I want to welcome everyone to another one of the talks for our fall fundraiser for the Game Academy. And we've got some real special guests here today gathered to talk to us about games and education. And it'll be a talk that will find its own pathway, I think. It is definitely a constructivist type of activity. If you viewers have any questions along the way, please put them in the comments. We will see them and get to them as we can. So first off, I'm going to just go from the screen left to right and top to down. We have Jeremy Yanofsky, who is the producer and creator of Engage, an online show on YouTube that is really talking explicitly about this interface between using games and doing education with them. It's not just in the classroom, but there's a lot of that goes on. And Jeremy himself is also an educator and has a history in that. I'll let him fill you in on that. I'm just forgetting all of my details. So thank you, Jeremy. And then we've got Anthony Adamo, who is a behavioral specialist and game master that works for the Game Academy. He also has a day job that actually pays the bills as a behavioral specialist in a local regional school. We have Stephen Hood here from Storium and Storium Edu. Stephen has been instrumental in creating an amazing tool that allows you to create narrative games based on a card concept, but it's really a lot more than that. I've used his tools myself in classes that I've taught, and it's a real amazing tool, I think, for teachers, educators who are looking for something to change the way they do delivery of information so it actually sticks and it also is fun. So thank you, Stephen. And we have Jeff Brain here, who is a lifelong educator. He's, I think, just retired from the public school system, but he's been involved in gaming for quite some time as well, and is part of the Casa Brain Games consortium that has run cons in the Bay Area, the San Francisco Bay Area, for 30-something years, and also has produced a number of different products, including the Spellgrounds playmats for collectible card games like Magic, etc. If I missed any pertinent details, I apologize. You guys can fill them in when we get started here. But first, let's just take some turns here. I'll ask a few questions of you guys that sort of pointed directly at what you do. Jeremy, you've been doing the Engage series for how long now?
Well, I've been making it since... I've been making it for a number of years, but it's been only a few episodes because of technical issues and whatnot. But yeah, it's I think I've done 7 episodes at this point.
Great. So tell us what's the focus of the program and where do you see it going?
Oh, so great. So the mission of Engage has been to we're learning through play is the name of the game, and the goal of the show is to make game-based learning of all kinds more accessible to educators everywhere. And so we've taken a look at EduLARP with Aaron Vanek. We've taken a look at Practomime with the Pericles group, where they basically they asked the question, what if your entire class from top to bottom was a game? And they did that for Latin, of all things. And most recently, we had an episode on Valve's Portal 2 and how I use that in the classroom to help kids overcome some obstacles with writing when it came to dialogue with characters, but also getting into other applications and more involving with STEAM education. And yeah, I've really wanted to explore the idea. I haven't, I always thought I was spending a lot of time years ago researching all kinds of different games and apps and web-based tools and thinking about how they could be used for education, as my background is also, I've been a humanities teacher for several years, but also my background is in educational technology and thinking very carefully about not just checking iPads at people because, you know, they're shiny or something, but like really trying to think practically about how do we best meet the needs of learners, and then thinking about what tools fit them most or best rather. And so I wanted to provide a resource in that vein when it comes to games of all kinds, and also to promote people out there who are doing exciting things like the Game Academy with role-playing games. And so that's what I'm doing with the show, and and everybody could check that out at youtube.com/engage show.
Awesome. We'll put some links on the recording page after we're done here to make sure that we get all that captured. So fantastic. We'll put that let's put that in the chat, and then we'll capture it later. So thank you so much. Games and education is such a broad topic these days. It's been kind of it's in many ways it might feel even a little played out in some cases. I think there's a sort of surface way of understanding it, and then there's a depth way of understanding, right? And I think, Jeff, you've been using games and role-playing games specific in your classes for some time during your stint. Tell us what brought you to make the decision that was something that you wanted to do, and what sort of benefits did you see that giving your students?
Well, I've been doing, I've been an educator for, I just retired after 25 years in the classroom. And early on in my career, I too was involved in ed tech. I have a master's in instructional technology. And my thesis there was using comics and the graphic novel as part of the classroom experience. And so one of my tenets always has been creativity and collaboration and communication. And those three areas, part of the ISTE standards, are key to what I've done. What I realized is not everyone can draw, not everyone is comfortable with that. So I quickly went into the idea of how can I incorporate game design into the classroom, and developed some really interesting methodology based on Common Sense Media. I was doing a beta testing for Common Sense Media and their digital citizenship curriculum, and came up with a way of incorporating role-playing games, which I've been involved with since the early 80s, into conflict resolution and research into modern technology, and how to turn that into a story, and at pinch points, roll dice, so things like that. Given a couple of talks at San Diego Comic-Con on that subject, very well received. And then recently, I'm gonna go right to one of my colleagues here on the panel, and that is got introduced to Storium Edu, and so using a game-based technology that Stephen and his company have come up with, use that to teach poetry. I've used it to teach history, and thrown in my own twists on the game world there. So I've been doing a wide range of things in the game education interface, including having students create their own games, teaching game design, which was fascinating for 6th, 7th graders, and very successful. So, yeah,
that's great. I mean, there's you know, it's a long history with a lot of different interfaces with this, and you know, we are kind of skimming the surface here, but that's a great lead in to this idea of not only you know, using games with your students, but having your students also create games. And I think Stephen, the Storium platform is really well suited for exactly this type of activity. Maybe have you talk a little bit about that and see how you know, if I'm a an English teacher or a history teacher or even a science teacher, like how can I make use of what you've created to really bring this type of learning into the classroom?
Sure. Thanks. So Storium is a collaborative storytelling game, essentially. And we made a version originally for like an adult audience, Storium.com. And we almost immediately started getting feedback from parents and teachers saying, hey, have you thought about using this with kids or using it in the classroom? And we hadn't actually, because we're not educators ourselves by background. We're technology folks. And so like my background is not in educational technology or education. So it was sort of like staring us right in the face, and we didn't see it until people pointed it out to us. And then we began to realize that, you know, what we had done was basically build a online digital writing version of those tabletop games that I had played growing up and had, unfortunately, as some of us do, sort of fallen away from as time went on. And that was in the back of my mind when I made Storium, that I wanted to recapture what those games were doing when I was younger and playing them with my friends, which is they were engines for collaborative storytelling. We were creating worlds together, we were creating characters, and we were cooperating to tell a story that was ours and ours alone. And the only thing that sucked about that was that it was ephemeral. It was gone, right? Once we were done playing, it was gone. And so, you know, fast forward many years, and I kind of realized we had sort of stumbled into creating something that recaptures some of that feeling in a less ephemeral way, but also almost accidentally in a way was an engine for getting people to write, right? It was providing a structure, a scaffolding, and a motivation for someone to want to write, not have to write, to want to write. And you know, as I learned more, as I have over the last few years from folks like Jeff and many other teachers, I came to appreciate just how dire the state of writing education often is, at least in U.S. schools. It's a serious problem. Like when something like 3/4 of 12th graders can't write at their grade level, I heard from an NEA stat. So it's a disturbing issue, and I get it though. Writing is really difficult for a lot of kids. It's very intimidating to approach because a blank page is sort of one of the greatest forms of tyranny. I like to say it's just like it just stares at you and just taunts you, right? So with Storium, what we did was we created a version for kids called Storium EDU. And it has a little more structure to it. And it has these ideas of playing cards, like virtual playing cards, that you, as a player, you have a hand of cards that represent sort of the narrative possibilities of your character. And when it's your turn, you play cards and use them as writing prompts. And then you draw another one to replace it. And thus, over time, you take turns writing a story, paragraph by paragraph, and your character grows card by card.
Yeah, it's a great game. It's a great tool for creativity. One of the things that I really loved about it when I was engaging with it was this idea that your character, just like when you're playing role-playing games or writing stories for that matter, they're not all good. They're not all positive. They're not all like, I can have these capabilities, you know, that sort of naive role play that we do when we're younger is the sort of playing superheroes on the playground, and like my power beats your power, my power beats your power. And then eventually like you're exhausted because it's just one-upping each other. But when you're playing complexity and the cards are saying like, I'm now going to have to do something that's not going to be beneficial to my story or to my character. It is beneficial to my story, but not to my character directly. Or
there's sort of a narrative economy.
Exactly.
Like you're incentivized to have your character fail or have setbacks because that allows you to earn the successes, which is what a good story is, right? You know, heroes struggle. A story where the action is just up and to the right is probably pretty boring, ultimately.
It is, exactly. That's the thing. And I think that not only does this help us narratively, but it also, especially when we're dealing with kids, it works into understanding kind of a ethics and morality issue of like, you know, am I always going to be doing the right thing? You know, do I even need to worry that I'm doing the right thing or that I'm trying to do the right thing? You know, that there's this understanding that, you know, mistakes are part of life. Failure is part of life. And it isn't about the failure itself or the mistake itself. It's where does it leave you for that next decision, right? And that's, I think, your game captures that well. And I think it is sort of the key lesson that we teach with our role-playing programs. And Anthony, I'll have you talk a little bit on that. And we've got a number of different participants that come into our program that that are at different levels. You know, you've got kids that are 10 years old and they're ready to run, you know, games for adults. And you've got kids that are 17 that you're still trying to get across the idea of you're in a party, you know.
Right. You're working as a team. It's not, you have to share the spotlight, if you will, which is definitely something that we try to teach. But going back to what we were talking about with having a safe place to fail, I think that's something that can't be overstated or stated enough, that role-playing games offer students a safe place where they can fail. And as educators, we all know that failure is the best teacher. It's the best part of growth if it's embraced and channeled positively, right? It's obviously no fun if you're like failing and failing and failing. It's like hitting your head against a wall, as my dad would say. It feels really great when you stop. But if you're embracing it and you're taught to learn from your failures and have that growth mindset, my favorite one of my favorite lectures is a TED Talk, and I don't remember the lady's name, but she talks about the power of yet, and I think that's what we try and instill with our kids specifically, is that I don't know how to do this. Well, you're missing the last word to that sentence. You don't know how to do this yet, because you are going to learn, because we're going to be here to help you learn that, and we're going to teach you. I love it when things go awry at my table and go absolutely sideways. Those are the best times when one student steals from another student. I always ask myself, all right, am I saying no because this makes my life easier, or am I saying no because I need to like keep the table health intact? And I try never to say no to my students. You want to do something? Sure. Let's see what happens. But then you have to remind them, hey, that's going to have a consequence. Could be good, could be bad, you know. And I think that's also a great tool, as role playing allows for behavior mapping, really in a pretty cool way, where your kids could do something totally crazy and unethical, and then you can stop it. All right, time out, which you can't do in real life, right? Time out. Let's look at that. You know, your character just like killed a bunch of kobolds. How do you? They're just living here like peacefully. You know, they've got their little colony, and then you guys just came in and were like, kobolds, get them. How do you think that that's gonna make other people treat you now? Are they going to be happy that you like slaughtered all of these kobolds, or are they going to be like, we need to keep our eye on those guys? So I love that role-playing games give you space for behavior mapping. And just behavior mapping in general is such a great tool for teaching social and emotional education. How does your behavior or your actions, how are they going to influence others? And and in turn, that influence is going to come back to you. How are they going to treat you based on that influence?
Mm-hmm. You know, this is interesting. And this, I think we bump into the interface between the design of games for entertainment and the design of games for education, and the goals that are there are not always in sync, you know. And as game masters who are also educators, we navigate this space, and we really have to be able to figure out when we need to guide the actions of the situation, as opposed to letting the rules guide us, right? And I think that probably that goes not just for role-playing games, but all sorts of games, that when you're adapting a game to an educational context, you really have to think at multiple levels at once, right? And that's, I think, kind of what makes what we do in this space special. There have been people that have been doing role-playing games since the 70s and arguably much before that, but for different purposes, and we're working against some habits and some stereotypes that have been established, that now with today's more awakened culture, we're all looking for different answers to those types of questions, right? So it's interesting, and to be at the epicenter of that is really interesting. So
it is different. You mentioned that people were designing, back when role-playing first came along, it wasn't really used for education, it was used for entertainment. And I think it still has that aspect of it. I think the large majority of us are playing role-playing games because it's fun. And I think that's the buy-in that we use with the kids, is that it's fun. It's a game. It's right there in the title, role-playing game. And it's about that hidden curriculum that is so powerful and so awesome. But you have to be careful with it too. You have to respect the power that it has. And Josh, that's where we talked about like lines and veils, and how those conversations, those very important conversations that you can have with your students, start to teach things like consent. And that's a topic that needs to be hammered into people as much as possible, in my opinion.
Yeah, no, I agree.
There's so much in the way of building all those soft skills when it comes to how do you collaborate with other people, and how do you, think about how to create that safe space for everybody to engage with, and when modeling that for the students, that's such a powerful thing to do, so that they can understand what it's like to create that atmosphere, and that gets to building like a positive work culture in whatever environment they go to beyond school. And I couldn't help but nod vigorously and laugh earlier when it just made me think of what you were describing before, Anthony, and also Jeff, with the emergent learning possibilities. Usually, and even with, I can imagine with Stephen with Storium too, and how it's so much of the great possibilities that come out of learning are the things that you don't plan for and you don't anticipate, that just kind of engender and generate themselves throughout the magic of what's happening. And those are surely a lot of my favorite moments.
Yeah, Jeff was the first person to use Storium for poetry. That was that wasn't even on my radar. Like, I didn't even understand how that would even work.
That's awesome.
And it did. Yeah, no, totally agreed.
Yeah, it was so interesting that the students wrote thousands and thousands and thousands of words, literally thousands of words in a very short time frame. The poetry unit was 6 weeks long, and they wrote successfully not only their own narrative, propelling the story forward, but composed original poems in over a half dozen different types of poetry that I modeled, and it was quite fascinating, all in a quasi-Asian, Middle Eastern milieu. So it was quite wonderful. This idea that collaborative writing is a powerful tool, and even reluctant writers were engaged and became part of the entire. It became almost competition amongst groups. I divided the class up into groups of anywhere from 3 to 5 students. So I was GMing, as it were, over a half dozen groups at any given time, shepherding them through the process, both the interface, which is of course something that every teacher has to deal with, is just that the content and the curriculum and so forth, but also just the mechanics of writing. And Storium Edu, Stephen has built in some wonderful tools for it. Teacher can suggest and edit and all these kinds of things. It's just a wonderful, wonderful tool. But I think, Jeremy, you touched on something, this idea of the soft skills, perseverance, grit, some buzzwords that are becoming very trendy in education. Games are a magnificent way to utilize the education platform as a way to teach soft skills. How do you engage with the student across the table in a collaborative group? Because most of these kids are going to be moving on into a collaborative work environment. And that's when you look at 21st century skills, that's high on the list of what an employer is going to be looking for, which brings me around to how do you rationalize games in a classroom? Because most of these kids' parents played games at some point, but it certainly was not part of their education. It was not part of school.
Yep.
And so
Absolutely.
it's teaching. Part of what I do working with fellow educators is working with them on how to justify this experience for the parents and the administrators and one's colleagues who this is not how they learned how to learn. So it's a whole new paradigm. So it's a lot of different things you're teaching. You're teaching adults in terms of why we're doing this, but you're also doing a great job of teaching kids. So
that's a huge part of what I'm striving to do and engage is be able to equip teachers with the tools, with whatever they need to explain, well, why am I using Settlers of Catan in the classroom? It's not just because I'm just, quote, here to play a game. For anybody who looks down on that kind of idea, it's like, no, I'm actually using this because this is really the perfect vehicle to do X, Y, and Z, and to really be specific about what X, Y, and Z are. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. I mean, it's so funny you bring up Settlers of Catan. Well, when one first looks at it, it's an idea. It's really a game of statistics modeling. Getting the maximum use out of your arable land. And this is not easy to convey out of a textbook. But you play Settlers a few times, and you recognize, if I'm building cities, I need ore. I need, and it's these kinds of trade-offs that you end up working with.
Yeah, I mean, it's you can divert pretty quickly into deep philosophy on some of this stuff, and I'm going to resist because that's where my brain usually goes. But
that's a whole panel in and of itself. Right?
It really is. But I do think that there is this idea that is a misguided concept that's been with us for quite some time, that somehow play and games are antithetical to work and learning. And in reality, if you look at human history and even animals in their own environments, play is exactly how they learn. And it's because it's contextualized activity. It's something that you're practicing, and that the play changes the rule set so that the circumstances are such that your consequences aren't going to be high stakes. Right. Play with, when you see two puppies going at each other, it looks like they're fighting, but they know and they've negotiated that that's not actually fighting. And so they're practicing.
And they're teaching each other where the boundaries are.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I think that the other side of this is that most people don't think about this, what I consider to be a truth, is that every modality of interaction is a game. That when you look at the standard classroom with the teacher at the front and the students in the seats, and the teacher's giving them information, and the students are putting it in their notebooks and they're remembering it, and then the teacher asks them about the thing, and then they tell the teacher that that's a game. It's just a dumb one. It's one that only a certain number of people enjoy.
Exactly.
And it unfortunately ties up a lot to do with identity and ego, and it can create insecurities. And I think that's where, when we start to look at using games as a narrative structure, so that you're introducing concepts in a way where if you get it wrong, it's okay. in order to get something wrong, you have to try it.
Yeah.
And if you're averse to getting things wrong, then you're going to be averse to trying things, right? And so games break us out of that mold. That it's the implication is you can lose a game, but it's not going to be you losing. It's just the game, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you try it again, and you try to win.
It doesn't mean you get an F. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I've always enjoyed the idea of co-creation. That game design is a co-creative process amongst a classroom. And myself, as an experienced gamer, might have a slight edge, but I'm really co-creating with my students. When we start a unit like the poetry unit that I did using Storium Edu, or when we're designing games based on research using PBS media, using above the noise videos, it's early in the conversation, in that first session or two, I'm asking the students, well, what do you want me, what should we be looking for in terms of assessment? What are the grading, what are we going to grade ourselves on here? And it's including the students in that process is very empowering. And that's a game in and of itself. In fact, I've even got the pieces and set up of how to do that as its own little game. But in terms of assessment, yes. So it's great stuff. I noticed in the chat area, someone was asking about 826 Valencia. I know Stephen and I have both worked closely with the Bay Area Writing Project, the California Writing Project, the National Writing Project, and I also work closely with a Bay Area-based company, Shut Up and Write. The idea of writing is really one of the keys to what we want to do as educators. But reading is also very important, and that's one of the great things about games and game design. You have to do a lot of reading and listening and all those really good skills that we need as people, as human beings, in order to write well. So, and games and game design is an umbrella for all of those skills. So it's great stuff.
Right, exactly. And, the way that games get played by different audiences is also sometimes very interesting to pay attention to. That when you're playing games with kids versus when you're playing games with adults, the way that they approach the concept of even playing the game and how do they associate with the person who's guiding that game. If it's a role-playing game, what's their relationship with the game master, what's the power structure there, and is it different than what you're seeing, in your typical classroom as well.
Right.
I think that there's a lot to learn, I think, both in terms of, playing games versus classroom dynamics, but also watching kids play and how they adapt to that power relationship. I think it's a lot different than what you see in adults.
It's a very useful tool too, role playing, especially in the therapy session, like using it for teaching social cognition. I mean, it's one of the main tools that's used in social cognition is either role playing or, diagnosing or breaking down a situation. Like, let's see what happens when Jimmy does this, and then let's talk about it. Especially working in like the SPED environment, our kids don't really have a lot of that. A lot of those skills that we take for granted that we get just by observation. A lot of our students don't have that. And so when we write curriculum for the Game Academy specifically, we're writing it so that there is a point where that conversation can happen. So like that stuff is very, and I think that's maybe where it differs from when you're writing modules for fun, or when you're writing your own fun content, and based on when you're writing for education. Because whereas you'd be totally happy if you're just having fun with your friends, if Jeff and I were playing and I was running a game and there was a bunch of goblins and Jeff's like, I'm going to go and kill all those goblins. He might be totally fine to do that. But with our kids, we want them to be able to problem solve that and have multiple ways to arriving at, the end product. Like there could be several ways. And I always find it interesting because my adult friends that play, their style is like, we want to get in there and we want to fight. But the kids that I play with are like, well, maybe we don't have to. Like, maybe let's just talk to them and see like what's up. It's a really interesting. It kind of puts for me, it put a lot of my preconceived notions kind of on its head. Like I would have expected that level of thinking from my adult friends and not from my kids. And it's nice to see that every once in a while that, they're constantly surprising me. And I think that's why I really enjoy it.
Yeah, I think that there is I would say that maybe part of it is we're inside the boat a little bit, and those of us who have been gaming for a very long time saw it in its sort of infancy and its less mature aspects. But I definitely think that, not just kids that are starting, but adults that have never played role-playing games before, they approach it with a different context. They're not objectifying everything as, something to kill or some treasure to take, right? But we've evolved. I think we've got a good 40, 50 years on this activity, and we've definitely seen publishers create games with more complexity, with aims on different types of rewards. I mean, that makes me think of like Monte Cook Games with their cipher system and them creating the reward system based on discovery as opposed to on what you kill and such. And even games like Dungeons and Dragons and Pathfinder, which is really just Dungeons and Dragons 3.5 extended. It's you get experience rewards for things that you accomplish that aren't necessarily killing a bad guy. So we're definitely seeing some broadening there.
This makes me think of Gloom and Fiasco, where really the incentive is to tell the craziest story you possibly can, or what's the worst thing that happens to your character, that sort of thing, and have fun with that.
Yeah.
It's interesting. Those are examples also of games where one of the technologies, if you will, as the term is used in tabletop, that's somewhat newer, or rather getting more adoption lately, is the sort of the GM-less game, right? Or games where that sort of responsibility is either diminished or is shared in some way. That's very interesting too. And the very first version of Storium that we made for classrooms was just Storium.com with like the serial numbers filed off, and it was like, hey kids, how does this work? And Jeff was one of the people who tested that. And, like there were a lot of issues with that. And one of them is like, if you've got one of the students in every group has to be the game master, that is, first of all, that's a tough job for a lot of kids, as we all know firsthand as adults. But it's a very uneven power dynamic for the rest of the people at the table,
Right.
And so that's a little weird. And then if the teacher instead plays that role, well, now the teacher's like GMing 10 games at once or something. And that also changed it too, because now you're playing with your teacher instead of playing with each other. So we actually moved to like a GM-less model with Storium Edu, where the cards kind of take up the slack for that in a way for the GM. But I'd be curious, I mean, like in your own experiences, do you find amongst yourselves in your work that the GM-DM model is a problem or not?
Why don't you go for it, Jeff?
Yeah, I'm going to say it's a lot of times in group work, there usually is some sort of project manager. And that often, what I do as a teacher is make sure that role is shared amongst a group. And Storium Edu does a nice job of where the person who starts a scene out of a 3-act play, for instance, that rotates.
Yeah.
based on card play. So there's less onus on one person being in charge the whole time. I noted when I did the game design units, it's always, sometimes I purposely chose the groups. Sometimes I let the kids self-select. When there is self-selection, there is usually a desire to have one, somebody in the group is already known as a leader by that time, 6th, 7th, 8th grade, where most of my recent experience was. So I would purposely mix things up so that the leader was not with their select group of peers, but was with a different group, and therefore might have to use a different leadership style with some different students. But this idea of GM-less, I think that is ideal in ongoing in education, because we want the students to be engaged to the point where they are willing to do deep research into Akkadian culture and see how that affected the rise of civilization in the Tigris-Euphrates. As opposed to reading a textbook, the paragraph or two about the Akkadians, mixed in there before or after Sargon and so forth. It's like you want that level of a willingness that any student can be in charge, and that's the GM-less variety.
Right.
Right. Another variety or another way that you can practice in that way is through live action role play. A lot of the live action games that you create, those modules, have a sort of systemic structure that sort of supports the interaction between the characters. And you might have monitors there that are kind of playing the role of goalie just to make sure people are, they know how the interface works. But you're not really injecting a lot of narrative into that space. You're setting it up and then letting it go. And I think that sort of exploratory interaction where you're trying things out and you're, feeling around the edges of what's going on is really teaching that kind of divergent thought process and that self-reliance as well. I think that the role of the game master can be one that becomes too rigid in the power structure. And I think, there's a lot of jokes for those of us that have gamed for a long time about, the power dungeon masters that have over their players, and the briberies and such, yada, yada. But, when we are with our game masters at the Game Academy, we teach them that you are a facilitator. You are not the leader. You are just facilitating the group to tell a story, and that role is one that you hold with responsibility, and you should be respected for the work that goes into it, but it doesn't make you a more important person. And in fact, you're kind of the sort of public servant in that equation. You've got the lowest job.
Oh yeah, you're doing a service to the others.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Yeah, I like that.
Yeah, and so I think that holding that idea can give them some ethical training as well, of like, oh, just because I'm the guy who's the quote unquote leader, I'm doing a lot of work here, and it's really in service of everybody else's fun, but it's satisfying, and it's rewarding when you have that experience. And so you're giving kids a service orientation through playing a game and teaching them, oh, you want to be the guy behind the screen? Cool. Let me show you how to do that. And by the way, it's not about you.
That brings up like what we teach in the GM praxis class too, it's really interesting that you brought that up, because we've had those conversations like recently with our kids, and it's funny when they're like, they'll get so zoned in on making their scene, and they want everything just right, and they want, this has to happen and this has to happen, and we'll let it play out. Yeah, great. Here, let me show you how to set up. We'll take care of all the mechanics of it. That's fine. Let me show you how to do all that. But then when it gets into coming and actually playing, and the people are coming to the table, that's a whole different aspect, because it does create a different power dynamic, because now you have a student who's running things. And sure, we're not abandoning them there. We're right there with them. But then you have to start asking your game masters in training, like, the question of, why are you doing this, or why do you want to be a game master? Is it because you want to tell your story, or is it because you want to be involved with other people telling the story together? So if you're wanting to tell your story, maybe looking at a different avenue to do that would be more appropriate. That's more of you're writing a novel. If you want to set the scene and then tell a story together with someone, you're in the right place. And we talk about, like, if you're killing your party, you have failed as a game master. Like, that's the biggest thing to teach our kids, because it's not an adversarial thing. There's not an overlord. Like, if you're approaching game mastering by that standard, then you're doing it wrong. And I mean, I always hesitate to just make a blanket statement, but I will stand by that statement. If you are coming into it as an adversarial position where you are looking to kill everyone at the table in new and creative ways, that is funny and entertaining, but you're doing it wrong, and you're missing out on the whole purpose of why you're sitting together and doing a thing.
Unless you're playing Paranoia.
Unless you're
Then it's your job to kill all the characters. That's okay. They've got 6 lives.
This sparks the thought of in that vein of what is this format? Why would you want to be the game master? One of the greatest things I was able to do with the middle school kids that I had last year as students was really take a look at different formats of storytelling and games and think about, why did somebody want to tell this story in a book as opposed to a movie, as opposed to a TV show, as opposed to a video game, as opposed to a role-playing game? What do all those different forms of media afford for the audience? And if there is somebody like a GM or a DM, why are those different things? Why do they all exist?
Right.
And so, and that's such a big thing to get into.
It's a huge thing. Yeah, that's a great topic. We kind of touched briefly about that in our adult GM class, which is something that both Josh and Jeff are intimately familiar with since they both teach it. But yeah, the teaching students and teaching adults how to GM, especially adults who have not touched it, they sometimes can get led astray too. It's like, well, why aren't we telling this in a story? Why are we trying to teach this in a role-playing environment instead of just writing a story? So I like what you were saying. That really makes a lot of sense.
Well, as you say that, I'm just thinking back on some of the more recent big sellers in fantasy and science fiction. Many of them started as games. Neil Stephenson and his group in Seattle were role-playing games and then came up with a collaborative novel. S.A. Corey or Covey, the two... Corey. Yeah. That's actually 2 people, and it began as an exercise in developing a science fiction role-playing game, which turned into The Expanse. So Patrick Rothfuss, same thing. Joe Abercrombie, same thing. These are writers who began their novels as exercises in role-playing games and still and played it out. And so that's it works both ways.
Totally, yeah. It's the creativity that goes into building a world. Whether or not you're going to let people, walk around your sandbox, or you're going to tell a story about somebody who walks the pathway through. There's a lot of the same work that needs to be done, for sure. And I mean, there's a lot of work that has to be done in any type of storytelling game modality. And I know that with Storium, there's a lot of pre-work that you spend. You can play a game that's already been put together for you and the decks that have already been created. But if you're really talking about creating your own game, there's a lot of work that goes into that process. And I think that that's something that is enriching. The work that you put into those, concepts is definitely something that you gain some understanding from.
Yeah, I think that's one of the superpowers of like role-playing games in particular among games, right? Is the world building aspect in addition to the character aspect, right? I mean, the character aspect gives you, something outside, an avatar outside your own ego to care about and be motivated by. And it's your window into another world, and that world, to the extent that you can play a role in fashioning it, that itself is almost a game itself.
Yeah.
We have people who play story and just make the settings essentially, and that's like the fun part for them. So that itself is a very engaging activity too, I think. Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. And there are some quote unquote role playing games which are really world building games as well, that fit that role.
Absolutely.
Yeah. It's the rules that you create within the game that you decide to play also really dictate the actions that you're able to take when you're playing that game. You're instilling into that game not just knowledge but ethics at a sort of, at least at a meta level, of what's considered in the rule set, what's considered good behavior, what is considered breaking the rules. The whole concept of cheating goes against this idea of consent. That when you sit down and you play a game, you are consenting to constrain your actions to a certain set of sub actions. You don't get to do anything you want to do. You can't just flip over the board of risk or shove the cards off the table. That's not considered a fair move. Nor can you take all the money out of the bank when you're playing Monopoly, right? So when we're creating games as game creators, we're really creating ethical structures as well. And I think that's an interesting concept. Do you find that with the work that you're doing, Stephen, with the worlds that end up being built in your platform, that becomes a note that people pick up on?
Definitely. I mean, I think this is a relevant example. One of the most popular setting for Storium Edu is the young adult dystopia, or the Divergent Hunger Maze, as I call it, which is just like all the tropes of the genre, in a blender that you can play with. And one of the things we realized very early on is one of the really common tropes of that genre is young romance. And so you want to talk about teaching consent in a classroom, right? You've got to be very careful if you want. Joey decides that Jenny's in love with his character, that ain't cool. So at first we kind of ran from it. We're like, there's not going to be any cards in this deck about love, and there's like, well, that feels sort of dishonest though. It feels a little flat. So you have to be careful with these sorts of things. Definitely.
Yeah, definitely.
So I'm going to throw a wrinkle out there that can help perhaps in some of this areas. One of the things I've done with game design and so forth is to incorporate a documentary portion to the whole process, so that those decisions are part of the documentary about that game and that game design. I've used it in both ways. I came up with this when I was teaching a multimedia unit, and based it on the chopped mode, the Food Network game, where you've got specific ingredients that you have to incorporate into the varieties of appetizer, main course, dessert, but then throwing in a documentary team that gave everybody something to do. So all the groups were, the documentary films are spectacular. I was teaching not only 3 different modes of multimedia in the 3 courses, but a 4th, which was documenting the experience. And so I would suggest to educators that this is another way to help define the game design process and hone your own skill as a teacher, is to create a documentary team somehow within the classroom, so that this whole idea of creating interviews, and so there's great multimedia work, and really enhances the experience of all.
It makes me think of the classic role-playing game party structure, that when we're engaging in these types of games, they're broad, and there's a specialization that happens with each of the participants, where that in any given activity you may or may not have a role, but over the course of the entire engagement, you will have your spot in the spotlight, and that when you're dealing with like group projects, I mean, this is the bane of education, because you want kids to learn how to work together, but in practice, what happens is the smart kid does all the work and the other kids sit and talk, because they're not given something that fits their strengths. That you're telling them, everybody be a wizard, go. And the wizard's fine, I'll be the wizard, and the fighter's picking his teeth with a sword, and then the bard's making jokes about the wizard and distracting him, But if you're saying, like, there's an adventure to be had here, and part of you have to do the wizarding, and part of you have to do the barding, and part of you have to do the fightering, then everybody's like, okay, I can get along with that. I'm going to be me. I'm going to do my thing, but we're going to work towards a common goal.
And then there's all the complexities of, I really thought I was a wizard, but actually I'm more of a rogue once I learned more about myself and all that, Yeah,
which is a fascinating way of self-exploration. Mm-hmm. Yeah, we are coming up on the hour. We got about 3 minutes left, and this has been a really engaging conversation. I want to thank all of the guests for coming. I'm going to give the audience just a quick chance to throw any questions out that maybe we didn't cover. And we can talk to those points, and if not, then we can say thanks for everybody coming. See if we'll give a moment here. Anybody out there? We had a few chatters. Maybe not. Well, let's end with if you have a quick favorite moment in your career where you've really been proud of the engagement of games in an educational context, and it's going to be different from each of you, and it could be something in the classroom, or maybe it's in your invention, creating something that did something you didn't know it was going to do, or you've made some exploration and found something out that really makes all of this work. Oh yeah, Chuck, you did miss this, that Jeff did talk about. He has had some involvement with the Valencia group and some of the writing projects around the Bay. I think that we can put that information in the chat maybe afterwards so that you can grab that. So, Anthony, you got anything that comes to mind?
This is a hard one, man.
I know. Softballs, right?
Last question. Jeez. I think one of my favorite times is when I was working as a one-to-one facilitator in the school system, and working with a child who was autistic, didn't know how to establish friendships, but really desperately wanted to belong, really desperately wanted those friendships. And so we got together with some of the cool kids, and I ran them through just a couple of games of Pathfinder. And they really got to know my kid for who he was instead of who he appeared to be through his behavior. And then he got to spend some time with quote unquote like neurotypical kids in a safe space, and he got to model their behavior, see how their behavior was modeled, and adopt that for himself. And then he made some long-lasting friendships that have lasted to this day with him. I think that it wasn't really particularly teaching social and emotional growth per se, but helping him learn how to build friendships. I still am very proud of that moment, and it tickles me every time I think about it.
Yeah, I have those too, and that's really when you see the personal growth that comes out of this work, not just, you know, any particular skills that get learned along the way, but it's really that kind of overall, like, oh, I can stand up taller in my own identity, right? You know, and I can engage. So I said let's do it, everybody, but we're at 3. So if we have any other stories, we can leave them in the chat. I'm sure we're going to get together again and talk on some more directed topics. This is a great team here. Thank you all for coming, and thank you all those who are watching from home. There's more to come for the day. Go to our website and check out the schedule. And there's going to be some neat things happening at the gala, some auction items that are going to be exciting for you to take a look at. One of those is a gift to the auction from Storium Edu. There's some licenses for Storium Edu that's going to be offered. It's a great gift that you can give to the teachers in your life, or you might even be able to give a gift to an entire English department. So that would be a great program to launch if all the teachers were doing this together. So,
well, now I need to go bid for my school. I gotta
there
go.
You go. All right, guys. Thank you so much, and I'll catch you on the next one.
Yeah, Jeremy. At some point, you and I need to get together.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah,
absolutely.
Really,
Stephen,
all
great
of us.
seeing you.